6 days after the flood, Meridian Quay Hotel
Both records could not be true.
accused waitress Celeste Morgan of endangering guests by opening a restricted ballroom.
Registered guests and employees only.
But her water-stained log showed 8 people safely sheltered at 11. 4:42 p.m. Celeste had defied orders to help elderly Josephine Vale
You will be responsible. I understand.
and was fired before breakfast. Then Josephine's billionaire son arrived. Instead of demanding revenge, Josephine requested the original log.
He is shivering more than I am.
You no longer have authority.
Then make a safer decision.
Mom,
Exposing 2 scans,
Find the original log.
a missing sentence, and a record changed at 2:17 a.m.
The room was changed at 2:17 a.m.
6 days after the storm, Celeste Morgan sat beneath the cold lights of Meridian Quay Hotel's smallest conference room and watched 2 versions of the same night appear on a wall-mounted screen. The first was Malcolm Rourke's incident report. It stated that the Magnolia Ballroom had remained secured throughout the flood warning. It described Celeste as an employee who had abandoned her assigned station, admitted unauthorized visitors through a restricted entrance, and opened a private event space without approval. The second record was a photograph of the hotel's emergency log. Across the page in Celeste handwriting were the words, "Magnolia Ballroom, activated as temporary refuge, 11:42 p.m." Beneath that line were 8 names, the time each person entered, and brief notes about their condition. No injuries, no missing property, no damage beyond 6 wet towels and 2 boxes of tea taken from restaurant storage. Both records could not be true. "Mrs. Morgan," said the woman chairing the review, "did Mr. Rourke give you verbal permission to open the ballroom?" "No." Malcolm shifted in his seat but kept his expression still. "Then why did you do it?" Celeste looked toward the screen. The photograph showed water stains along the bottom of the page. She remembered wiping rain from her hands before picking up the pen. She remembered checking the wall clock twice because emergency reports required exact times. The river road was closed, she said. The bus shelter had started taking water, and the city alert instructed people in that block to move indoors. Our emergency manual listed Magnolia as the hotel's public refuge area. "Public," Malcolm repeated. "It is a private ballroom during normal operations." The review chair turned to him. Was the ballroom designated as an emergency refuge? "It had been considered for that purpose," Malcolm replied. "The designation was never formally activated." Celeste felt the same cold certainty she had felt when security escorted her out before sunrise. Malcolm was not answering the question. He was arranging words around it. At the far end of the table, Nora Kim sat with both hands resting on a closed audit folder. As night auditor, she had access to room status changes, keycard records, and the hotel's archived safety documents. She had barely looked at Celeste since the meeting began. Beside the door sat Josephine Vale, the elderly woman Celeste had admitted from the storm. Her sage green coat was dry now, but she held it folded across her lap as if she might need to leave at any moment. Celeste had not known Josephine would attend. The sight of her brought back one clear detail from that night. Josephine refusing the warmest chair because another stranded passenger was shivering harder. That small gesture had told Celeste more about her than any name or reservation could have. Malcolm's attorney enlarged the hotel's current emergency map on the screen. Magnolia Ballroom was marked in gray. "No refuge symbol," he said. "No authorization for public access." "When was that file created?" Celeste asked. The attorney glanced at Malcolm before answering. "It is the version currently stored in the hotel system." "That wasn't my question." The room became quiet, but dramatically so. The ventilation continued humming. A printer operated somewhere beyond the wall. Rain tapped lightly against the narrow window, softer than it had 6 nights earlier. The review chair leaned toward the screen. Do we have the version that was active on the night of the incident? Nora's fingers tightened around the edge of her folder. Malcolm answered first. The active document is the one you are viewing. Celeste reached into the envelope in front of her and removed a folded sheet of paper. It was the safety checklist issued during staff training 3 months earlier. Magnolia Ballroom appeared on the second page beside a green refuge symbol. Malcolm studied it without touching it. That may have been a draft. It has your signature at the bottom, Celeste said. He looked at the review chair. This meeting concerns Ms. Morgan's conduct, not minor inconsistencies in administrative paperwork. Administrative paperwork is why I was fired. Celeste's voice did not rise. She had spent 6 days imagining the things she would say if given this chance. Anger had provided dozens of speeches. Sitting across from Malcolm, she understood that none of them mattered as much as a date, a signature, and a record he could not explain. The review chair asked Nora to open the audit folder. Inside was a printed timeline of every change made to Magnolia Ballroom's digital classification. The room had been listed as an emergency refuge at 11:42 p.m., exactly as Celeste had written. At 2:17 the following morning, someone changed it to private event space. Restricted. Celeste had already been removed from the building by then. Whose credentials authorized that change? The chair asked. Nora stared at the page. Her lips parted, but no answer came. Malcolm placed one hand on the table. Before he could speak, Celeste noticed Nora looking directly at him, and in that moment, the review stopped being a question of why Celeste had opened the door. It became a question of who had tried to erase what happened afterward. The storm had begun as a thin, gray rain. Before the dinner shift, the kind guest noticed only when someone opened the restaurant doors. By 10 o'clock, water was running down the hotel windows in sheets. Celeste Morgan carried 2 plates of sea base toward table 19, while the river beyond the glass disappeared behind rain and reflected traffic lights. Inside, Meridian Quay remained warm and carefully controlled. Candles burned without flickering. Glassware shone beneath brass pendant lamps. A pianist finished his final set, while guests checked weather alerts beneath the table. The hotel had built its reputation on making the outside world feel distant. That evening, the distance was becoming dangerous. Celeste delivered the plates and returned to the service station. Her phone displayed 3 emergency notifications. River Road was closed. The eastern bus route had stopped operating. People within 2 blocks of the waterfront were advised to seek shelter above street level. She showed the alert to the restaurant supervisor. He's already seen it, the supervisor said, nodding toward Malcolm Rourke. Malcolm stood near the reservation desk, speaking quietly into his radio. His suit remained perfectly dry, but his jaw tightened each time the front doors opened. At 10:15, he gathered the remaining staff beside the kitchen. We are closing early, he said. Finish the occupied tables, settle every check, and direct registered guests to their rooms. What about people outside? Celeste asked. Security will handle the entrances. The city alert says businesses should provide temporary shelter where possible. Malcolm looked at her as if she had raised an issue he had already solved. We are not a municipal shelter. We have private functions scheduled tomorrow, and we cannot accept responsibility for unidentified members of the public. Celeste glanced toward Nora Kim at the front desk. Nora had heard the order. She lowered her eyes to the computer. What about Magnolia? Celeste asked. It's listed in the emergency manual. That designation was provisional. It was included in our training. This is an operational decision, Celeste. Close your tables. His tone was quiet enough that no guest turned around. Malcolm rarely shouted. He had learned that authority sounded stronger when everyone else was required to lean closer. Celeste finished serving the remaining diners. She called taxis that never arrived and helped 2 hotel guests carry their luggage away from a leaking window. At 11:10, the pianist left through the staff corridor because the main entrance had been locked. Most employees were told to remain until transportation could be arranged. Celeste was stacking clean cups when she heard knocking from the service entrance. The door stood beyond the kitchen loading area, separated from the dining room by 2 swinging doors and a narrow corridor that smelled of coffee grounds and laundry steam. At first, she assumed wind was moving something against the metal. Then the knocking came again. 3 quick strikes. A pause. 2 more. She looked through the reinforced window. An elderly woman stood beneath the shallow awning. Her sage-green coat was dark with rain. Behind her were a bus driver, a young restaurant dishwasher from across the street, and 5 other people pressed close to the wall. Water had already crossed the pavement behind them. The older woman looked directly at Celeste and raised one hand. Not waving, not pleading, simply making sure she had been seen. Celeste reached for the lock. "Don't!" said a security guard behind her. "They can't stay there. Mr. Rook's order. Registered guests and employees only. The road is flooding." "I know." The guard's face held no cruelty, only fear of choosing wrong in a workplace where orders were remembered longer than emergencies. Celeste picked up the wall phone and called Malcolm. "There are 8 people at the service door," she said. "The water is coming over the curb. Tell them to move north toward the parking structure. The city closed that block. Then contact emergency services." Celeste had already tried. The line had placed her in a queue behind more than 40 callers. "Magnolia is empty," she said. "It has an exterior safe route, restrooms, and no guest room access. You do not have authorization to open it. The written policy gives the senior employee on scene authority when there is an immediate risk. I am the senior manager on scene, and you're telling them to walk into a closed street." There was a long pause. When Malcolm spoke again, his voice had lost its professional softness. "If you unlock that door, you will be personally responsible for every person who enters this property." Celeste looked through the glass. The bus driver had removed his jacket and was holding it above the elderly woman's head. It made little difference. Rain blew beneath the awning, and the water behind them was rising. Years earlier, Celeste had watched a supervisor ignore the smell of overheated wiring in a restaurant storeroom. She had noticed it first. She had accepted his assurance that someone else would deal with it. A coworker had spent weeks recovering from the smoke. Since then, Celeste had carried one rule more faithfully than anything printed in a handbook. When a danger was visible, passing responsibility to someone else did not make it disappear. She hung up the phone. The security guard stared at her. "You heard him." "I did." Celeste removed her staff key from the retractable cord at her waist. The emergency lock produced a sharp, electronic beep as she inserted it. Somewhere inside the hotel system, her name, the door number, and the exact second were being recorded. She turned the key anyway. The service door opened against the pressure of the wind, and rain swept across the corridor floor. Celeste held it while the 8 strangers entered one by one. She counted them aloud, partly to keep order, and partly because training had taught her that numbers became unreliable when everyone was frightened. The bus driver came first, supporting a young man whose shoes had filled with water. A restaurant dishwasher carried a plastic bag containing his uniform and phone. 2 office workers entered together, followed by a delivery cyclist, a woman from the bus shelter, and an older man who kept apologizing for dripping on the tiles. Josephine Vale entered last. "Is everyone here?" Celeste asked. Josephine looked back through the rain before answering. Everyone who was at the shelter. The security guard closed the door and engaged the lock. He did not help Celeste, but he did not order anyone outside either. Sometimes courage began as nothing more impressive than refusing to interfere. Celeste guided the group through the service corridor. The hotel looked different from that side. Guests saw polished stone and floral arrangements. Employees saw exposed pipes, laundry carts, handwritten delivery schedules, and doors that opened only for the correct level of authority. Magnolia Ballroom stood at the end of the corridor. Celeste's key card unlocked the first door, but not the lighting panel. She found the emergency switch behind a brass cover. Rows of ceiling fixtures illuminated an empty room prepared for the following afternoon's business luncheon. White tablecloths covered 30 round tables. Silverware had already been arranged. A portable stage waited beneath a blank projection screen. The stranded guests stopped at the entrance, uncertain whether they were truly allowed inside. "You are now," Celeste said. "Please stay away from the windows and keep the central aisle clear." She asked the bus driver to help move chairs. The cyclist placed wet backpacks on a surface mat. The security guard retrieved a yellow caution sign for the floor without being asked. Celeste collected towels, disposable cups, 2 tea boxes, and a large container of hot water from the restaurant. She documented each item before using it. If Malcolm intended to call this theft, she wanted the inventory to be exact. When she returned, Josephine was standing beside the warmest chair near a floor vent. She had draped the bus driver's damp jacket across it for him. "That one was meant for you," Celeste said. "He is shivering more than I am. You've been outside longer. That doesn't make me colder." Celeste almost smiled. "You argue like someone who has spent a lot of time behind a library desk." 41 years. Josephine accepted a cup of tea but remained standing until everyone else had found a place. Her hands trembled slightly when she raised the cup. She noticed Celeste watching, rested it on a table. "I'm not fragile," she said. "I didn't say you were. You were thinking it very professionally. I was thinking that the cups are thin and the tea is hot." That earned a small laugh. Outside, rain hammered the high windows. A flash of light appeared beyond the curtains, followed seconds later by distant thunder. One of the office workers checked her phone and announced that the city had expanded the road closure. No one would be leaving soon. Celeste placed the emergency log on a serving table. She wrote the opening time and asked each person for a name and contact number. Josephine watched her form every letter. "You document everything?" she asked. "Everything someone might later pretend didn't happen." There was more bitterness in Celeste's answer than she intended. Josephine did not ask for an explanation. She simply gave her name, address, and phone number. When Celeste asked for an emergency contact, Josephine hesitated. "My son, what's his name?" "Julian. Phone number?" Josephine recited it from memory. Celeste noticed several missed calls on the older woman's phone. "Does he know where you are?" "He knows where I was supposed to be." "Which was?" "Here." Celeste looked at her. Josephine gestured toward the ballroom. "Not this room. The restaurant upstairs. We were meant to have dinner at 9. You had a reservation. Under his name, I imagine. Why didn't you enter through the lobby?" "The bus stopped 6 blocks away. By the time I reached the front entrance, it was locked. I walked toward the service lights because I saw people at the shelter. You could call them now." Josephine turned the phone face down on the table. "My son solves problems by making them larger than they need to be. Tonight's problem is already fairly large. He would arrive with assistants, drivers, and opinions. Then no one would remember that 7 other people needed help too." Celeste studied her for a moment. Josephine did not sound ashamed of her son. She sounded tired of being treated as a situation he could manage. "Call him before he reports you missing," Celeste said. "You don't have to ask him to rescue you." Josephine considered that distinction. Before she could respond, the ballroom doors opened. Malcolm entered with 2 security officers behind him. Rain marked the shoulders of his suit, and his usually controlled expression had hardened. His eyes moved across the occupied tables, the towels, the tea, and the names in the emergency log. He looked past the people as if the room itself had disobeyed him. "What have you done?" he asked. "I activated the refuge area," Celeste said. "I explicitly told you not to open this room. The road is closed. No one can safely leave. That is no longer your decision." Malcolm took the emergency log from the table and examined Celeste's entries. Josephine seen rose, but Celeste gave her a small shake of the head. She did not want Malcolm to believe anyone needed status or influence before being allowed out of the rain. He placed the log beneath his arm. "Security will relocate these people," he said. "You will surrender your keys and leave the floor immediately." "Relocate them where?" Malcolm looked toward the doors. "The loading area until transportation can be arranged." Celeste stared at him. The loading area was on the ground level, beside the entrance where water had already crossed the pavement. She stepped between Malcolm and the people seated behind her. "No," she said. Malcolm stared at Celeste as if the word had come from someone else. "No," he repeated. "The loading area is lower than this room," Celeste said. "Water is already past the service entrance. You are suspended from duty. You no longer have authority to make that decision. Then make a safer one." The bus driver stood. "She's right. I drove that route for 12 years. If the drains back up, the loading lane will fill first." One of the security officers looked toward Malcolm. "The exterior camera shows water against the lower step." For several seconds, no one spoke. Malcolm had expected resistance from Celeste. He had not expected the room to become a collection of witnesses. "Everyone will remain here until the city clears the road," he finally said. "Security will supervise. Ms. Morgan, surrender your keys." Celeste unclipped the key cord from her waist and placed it in his hand. Malcolm turned toward the door. "The log stays here," she said. "It is hotel property. It is also an active emergency record, and I am responsible for preserving it." He walked out with the water-stained book beneath his arm. The ballroom remained open, but Celeste was escorted to the employee break room. She sat alone beneath a clock that ran 4 minutes fast while the sounds of the storm moved through the walls. At 12:30, someone brought her coat. At 1:15, the restaurant supervisor entered, avoided her eyes, and removed Celeste's name badge. At 2 o'clock, the rain began to weaken. No one asked for her account. Celeste had spent 14 years learning the hotel's rules. She knew how many minutes a guest should wait before being offered water. She knew which elevator moved most smoothly for wedding cakes and which kitchen drawer caught unless lifted before opening. She knew the names of housekeepers' children and which banquet porter needed Wednesdays free to care for his father. None of that knowledge appeared in the incident form Malcolm placed before her at 5:20 in the morning. The document reduced the night to 3 accusations: unauthorized access, misuse of hotel property, and refusal to follow a direct instruction. "If you sign this," Malcolm said, "it confirms only that you received it." The human resources manager attended through a video call. Her face appeared in a small square on Malcolm's laptop, distorted by an unstable connection. Celeste read the final paragraph twice. It stated that her employment was terminated immediately for gross insubordination. "You decided this before asking what happened," she said. "The access records are clear," Malcolm replied. "You opened a secured door after being told not to. The city issued a shelter order. You were not authorized to interpret that order on behalf of the hotel. I followed the emergency manual. That document did not override management. Then why train us to use it?" The human resources manager interrupted. "Mrs. Morgan, this meeting is not an appeal. You also will receive instructions for requesting a formal review." Celeste looked through the conference room window. The sky had begun turning pale beyond the river. Hotel staff were resetting the lobby before morning arrivals. Chairs were straightened. Damp warning signs disappeared. By breakfast, there would be little evidence that the building had sheltered anyone. She pushed the form back unsigned. "I received it," she said. "I don't agree with it." Malcolm closed the folder. Security escorted Celeste through the front lobby rather than the service corridor. She carried her coat over one arm and a paper bag containing a spare blouse, comfortable shoes, and the small tin of hand cream she kept in her locker. Josephine was waiting near the entrance. The other stranded travelers had already left after roads reopened. Josephine remained in the same clothes, her silver twist slightly flattened on one side from resting against a ballroom chair. "They fired you," she said. Celeste stopped. "How do you know?" "No one would tell me where you were. That usually means someone is ashamed of the answer." "It's done. You should go home." "I called my son. Good. He is almost here." Celeste gave her a tired smile. "Then I'm glad you won't have to wait for another bus." A dark sedan stopped beneath the hotel canopy. It was followed by a second vehicle carrying 2 members of a corporate security team, but no one rushed toward the doors. A tall man in a charcoal overcoat stepped from the first car. He crossed the lobby quickly, ignoring the hotel employees who recognized him. "Mom." Josephine allowed Julian Vale to embrace her for only a moment before stepping back. "I am unharmed," she said. 8 people were given shelter. The woman who opened the door was dismissed. Julian looked at Celeste, then at Malcolm approaching from the conference corridor. Malcolm's posture changed before he reached them. His expression softened into the practiced welcome reserved for important clients. "Mr. Vale," he said, "I had no idea your mother was involved." "That appears to be the problem," Josephine replied. Celeste recognized Julian's surname then. Vale North Logistics was preparing to hold its International Leadership Conference at Meridian Quay. The contract was large enough to determine the hotel's quarterly results and Malcolm's performance bonus. Julian turned to him. "You fired an employee for getting my mother out of a flood?" Malcolm lowered his voice. "The situation is more complicated than that. Ms. Morgan violated security protocols and exposed every guest in this hotel to an unacceptable risk. Cancel the conference," Julian said to one of his assistants, "and have legal." "No," Josephine interrupted. Julian looked at her. "Mom, they left you outside." And Celeste opened the door. "Do not turn her decision into an excuse to display what you can destroy. He fired her. Then we will find out whether he had the right." Julian's anger did not disappear, but he fell silent. Josephine faced Malcolm. I do not want special treatment, complimentary rooms, or a private apology. I want the written policy that was active last night. I want the names of the people who witnessed what happened. And I want the emergency record Celeste completed in that ballroom." "It has been secured," Malcolm said. Josephine's eyes remained on him. "Where is the original log?" Malcolm did not answer Josephine's question directly. He said the log had been transferred to the administrative office. Then he said emergency documents were routinely processed before being archived. Finally, he promised that a complete copy would be available after the hotel's legal department reviewed the incident. By noon, Josephine had submitted a written complaint as one of the 8 people sheltered in the ballroom. Celeste filed her employment appeal from the kitchen table of her apartment. She wrote it without Julian's lawyers. Julian had offered help, but Celeste did not want the hotel to claim that an ordinary personnel dispute had become a rich man's personal campaign. Josephine agreed. She gave Celeste the contact information for a nonprofit employment clinic and offered something more useful than influence: a precise witness statement. In it, Josephine described the water outside the service entrance, the city warnings visible on multiple phones, the condition of the loading lane, and every instruction she heard Malcolm give. She did not mention her son's wealth until the final line. "My identity became important to the hotel only after the danger had passed." The sentence stayed with Celeste. For 14 years, She had believed good service meant learning what people needed before they had to ask. Meridian Quay had taught that principle in every training session. Yet the hotel's response to the storm suggested a different rule. Attention was offered first to people whose importance was already known. 2 days after the firing, Celeste received the hotel's evidence packet. The emergency map showed Magnolia Ballroom as a restricted private space. Malcolm's incident report stated that Celeste had ignored a safe alternative, the covered loading area, and brought strangers into contact with hotel guests. The packet contained no photograph from the loading area camera. It contained no city flood warning. The emergency log appeared near the end. The copy was clean and sharply scanned. Celeste's entries were present, but the first line identifying the ballroom as an activated refuge was missing. She called Josephine. "They changed it. Are you certain?" "I wrote the first line before anyone gave me their name. The ink ran near the bottom because my sleeve was wet. Their copy has no watermarks." "Then it is not the document I saw Malcolm carry away." Celeste looked at the papers spread across her table. Without the original, her memory was only another statement the hotel could challenge. "What if the review changes nothing?" she asked. "Then the truth will still have been placed where they cannot say, 'See, no one raised it.' That doesn't pay rent." "No," Josephine said. "It does not." There was no inspirational answer to that. Celeste appreciated her for not inventing one. At Meridian Quay, Nora Kim worked 3 consecutive night shifts while the hotel returned to normal. The ballroom hosted its luncheon. The damaged bus shelter was removed from the sidewalk. Guests complained about traffic delays and praised the staff for remaining calm during the storm. Malcolm asked each employee who had been present to sign a standardized summary. It stated that Celeste had acted independently, that no manager had instructed anyone to remain outside, and that the loading area had been available as a temporary waiting space. The security guard refused to sign the final sentence. His schedule was reduced the following week. The restaurant supervisor signed all 3. Nora took the document home without signing it. She had spent her career believing records were safer than people. Numbers did not become embarrassed. Software did not fear losing its health insurance. A timestamp could not be persuaded that it remembered too much. But records were only as honest as the people responsible for preserving them. On the night of the flood, Magnolia Ballroom had changed status twice. At 11:42 p.m., the emergency panel registered Celeste's key and automatically marked the room as an active refuge. That status appeared in Nora's midnight operational report. At 2:17 a.m., Malcolm's administrative credentials changed the room back to restricted use. The current system displayed only the latest classification. The nightly accounting archive, however, preserved a snapshot of the earlier one. Nora found it attached to a routine revenue report no one had thought to delete. She also found the service door entry at 11:36, the ballroom entry 6 minutes later, and a restaurant terminal transaction showing 2 boxes of tea and 6 towels assigned to emergency use. The transaction had been approved by the security guard's employee code. The evidence did not prove Celeste had followed every instruction. It proved she had not acted secretly. At 3 in the morning, Nora entered the administrative copy room. She printed the midnight report, the access history, and the inventory transaction. Then she searched the scanner's temporary storage. Malcolm had asked her to scan the original emergency log shortly after removing it from the ballroom. She had stood beside her until the process finished, then taken the book into his office. Nora had assumed the scan was gone. The machine retained low-resolution previews for 7 days. She opened the final image. There was Celeste's first line. There were the water stains. In the lower corner, partly covered by Malcolm's hand, was the time recorded by the scanner, 12:18 a.m. The clean document in Celeste's evidence packet had been scanned the following morning. Nora printed both versions. When Malcolm arrived at 7, he found her at the front desk. "Have you completed your witness summary?" he asked. "I'm reviewing it. There is nothing to review. It is a summary of established facts. Some of the facts are missing." Malcolm's expression barely changed. "Be careful, Nora. Ms. Morgan made a choice. You are not responsible for protecting her from the consequences." "No," Nora said. "I'm responsible for the records." That evening, Celeste left the employment clinic carrying a list of questions she expected the review panel to ask. She had no promise of reinstatement and no certainty that the hearing would remain independent once Julian's contract became part of the dispute. Nora was waiting across the street. She held a plain hotel envelope against her coat. "I can't guarantee what they'll do with this," Nora said, "and if I testify, I may lose my job." Celeste did not reach for the envelope. "You don't owe me that." "I know." "Then why are you here?" Nora looked down at the papers. She had spent years trusting more than her own voice. "Because the system remembered," she said. "And I'm tired of helping people pretend it didn't." Celeste accepted the envelope. For the first time since her dismissal, she understood that the review would not depend on Josephine's surname or Julian's money. It would depend on whether ordinary employees were willing to place the truth on the record. Nora's answer came quietly. The credentials belonged to Malcolm Rourke. The review chair looked from the audit report to Malcolm. "Did you change Magnolia Ballroom's classification at 2:17 a.m.? "Yes," he said. "I corrected a temporary created when Ms. Morgan used her key." "Why was that correction not disclosed in your incident report?" "Because it did not alter the underlying facts. The ballroom was not approved for public use." Nora opened the folder in front of her. "It was approved," she said. "The designation was added 3 months earlier after the city updated its waterfront emergency plan. It remained active until Mr. Rourke changed it." Malcolm's attorney objected that Nora was interpreting documents outside her authority. The external safety consultant on the panel asked to see the training checklist Celeste had produced. Malcolm's signature appeared beneath the list of approved refuge spaces. He leaned forward. That checklist assumed management authorization. Celeste received a direct order not to admit unknown individuals. She opened a secured area, distributed hotel supplies, and refused to surrender control when instructed. Those actions created legal exposure. "Did anyone enter the guest floors?" the consultant asked. "No." "Was any property stolen?" "No." "Was anyone injured?" "No." "Was the loading area safe?" Malcolm paused. Conditions were changing. The security guard had been called to the hearing as witness. He sat near the wall in a borrowed jacket, uncomfortable beneath the conference room lights. "At 11:47, he said. The exterior camera showed water at the first loading step. I told Mr. Rourke before he entered the ballroom. Did you believe moving the group downstairs was safe? No. Why didn't you say so in the ballroom? The guard glanced toward Celeste. I was afraid of losing my job. No one criticized him. Celeste understood too well how fear could make a reasonable person sound obedient. The panel examined the 2 scans of the emergency log. The first contained Celeste's refuge declaration, watermarks, and the 8 names. The second was clean and lacked the opening line. Malcolm said he had rewritten the damaged page to make it legible. Why wasn't it labeled as a replacement? The review chair asked. It should have been. Why did you omit the first entry? I believed the entry was inaccurate. You believed that after changing the room status yourself? Malcolm looked toward his attorney. For the first time, Celeste saw something beneath his practiced control that was not simply as. It was fear. The Vale North Conference represented months of negotiations. Malcolm had promised the hotel's owners a flawless luxury experience, improved security, and a quarter without costly incidents. When the flood began, he had seen stranded people not as human beings in danger, but as variables he could not control. Afterward, he had tried to make the records match the decision he wished he had made. Understanding that did not excuse him, it only made the failure recognizable. The review chair turned to Celeste. "Do you accept that you disobeyed a direct instruction?" "Yes." Malcolm looked up. Celeste continued before anyone could mistake honesty for surrender. "I was told to send 8 people toward a closed road and later move them into an area that security had confirmed was taking water. The emergency manual gave the senior trained employee present authority to activate Magnolia when delay created additional risk. Mr. Rourke was present. He was in another section of the hotel when I opened the service door. When he reached the ballroom, the refuge had already been activated. Closing it would have increased the danger. Would you make the same decision again? I would call emergency services again. I would document Malcolm's refusal in writing. I would ask security to speak into the incident recorder." She looked at the training checklist. "But I would still open the door." Josephine test. She described the water, the failed transportation, and Celeste's careful handling of every person in the room. She also explained that Celeste had treated her exactly like the 7 other strangers. "Did Ms. Morgan know your relationship to Julian Vale?" the panel asked. "No." "Did you offer her any benefit for admitting you?" "No." "Would your complaint have been filed if your son were not a major hotel client?" Josephine considered the question. "I would have filed it. I cannot promise anyone would have read it as quickly." Julian had disclosed his company's pending contract before the hearing began. He informed the panel that Vale North had suspended venue negotiations, but had not demanded any employment outcome. Then he left the room during the confidential staff testimony. It was the first time Celeste saw him use his influence by stepping away from it. The panel recessed for 40 minutes. When they returned, the review chair read the findings without ceremonies. Celeste had acted within a reasonable interpretation of the hotel's emergency policy. Her termination had been issued before a complete investigation. Evidence had been omitted from her employment file, and the original incident record had been replaced without proper notation. The termination was overturned. Nora's evidence was referred for a separate records integrity investigation. The reduction of the security guard's shifts would also be reviewed as possible retaliation. Malcolm did not look at Celeste when the decision was read. After the hearing, a representative from the hotel's ownership group met Celeste in a smaller room. He offered reinstatement, back pay, and compensation for her legal expenses. The agreement included a confidentiality clause. Celeste read it carefully. If she signed, she could return to work on Monday. Her rent would be safe. The hotel would announce that the matter had been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. No employee would be permitted to discuss the altered record, the loading area order, or the reason Magnolia's designation had disappeared. She placed the agreement on the table. "I'm not signing this." The representative appeared genuinely surprised. "The offer restores everything you lost. It restores my job. That isn't everything." "What additional compensation are you requesting?" "None." Celeste asked for a new emergency policy that could not be reversed by one manager during an active warning. She asked for permanent protection for employees who documented safety concerns, restoration of the security guard's shifts, mandatory preservation of original incident records, and annual emergency training for every supervisor. The representative listened without writing. "You understand these decisions cannot be made today?" "Yes." "And reinstatement may depend on resolving the agreement as written." "Then you have another decision to make." Celeste stood. At the door, she turned back. "Next time someone is outside in the rain, they shouldn't need a billionaire's mother beside them before this hotel remembers what the room is for." For 3 days after the review, Celeste heard nothing from Meridian Quay. She accepted 2 temporary catering shifts and calculated how long her savings would cover rent. Overturning the termination had cleared her name, but it had not restored her income. The hotel still wanted silence in exchange for security. Josephine called each evening. She never asked Celeste to reconsider. She asked whether she had eaten, whether the employment clinic had returned her messages, and whether she needed someone to accompany her to the next meeting. Julian offered money once. Celeste declined once. He did not offer again. Instead, he gave the hotel ownership group written notice that Vale North Logistics would choose another venue for its conference that year. The letter did not mention Celeste's reinstatement. It cited the hotel's failure to preserve safety records and its treatment of employees who reported emergencies. The owners could no longer describe the incident as a disagreement between one waitress and one manager. A week later, they accepted Celeste's conditions. The confidentiality clause was removed. The security guard's missing shifts were restored with back pay. Original incident records would be stored in a protected digital archive, and any correction would preserve the previous version, the editor's identity, and the time of the change. During an active city warning, designated refuge rooms could no longer be deactivated by a single manager. Every employee received written authority to act when waiting for approval would increase an immediate danger. The hotel also created a safety training position and offered it to Celeste. She took 2 days to answer. Returning meant walking through the same lobby where she had carried her belongings in a paper bag. It meant working beside employees who had remained silent and supervisors who had accepted Malcolm's version because accepting it had been easier. But leaving would allow the hotel to frame reform as a document rather than a practice. Celeste accepted on the condition that the position include direct access to the ownership safety committee. She would still work restaurant shifts twice a week, not because the owners required it, but because she did not want leadership to separate her from the employees affected by its decisions. Nora remained the night auditor. Her testimony became part of the hotel's new records integrity training, though her name was not used without permission. Malcolm was removed from emergency operations while the records investigation continued. He resigned before it concluded. There was no public confrontation and no announcement celebrating his departure. His name disappeared from the weekly management schedule. His office was reassigned. The consequences arrived through the same kind of documentation he had once believed he could control. 4 months later, Meridian Quay conducted its first flood response exercise. Celeste stood in Magnolia Ballroom while restaurant servers, housekeepers, security officers, cooks, and front desk employees practiced converting the event space into a refuge. They learned where the towels were stored, how to record names, which entrances remained above the flood line, and who could contact city emergency services. They practiced without waiting for the highest-ranking person in the building. Above the ballroom doors, the hotel installed a green emergency light. It was visible from both the lobby and the service corridor. The light was not a monument to Celeste. It did not carry her name. That was how she wanted it. Its purpose was to help the next employee make the right decision, before anyone asked who was standing outside. Josephine and Julian eventually returned for the dinner the storm had interrupted. The reservation was made under Josephine's name. Julian arrived without assistants or security officers. He placed his phone face down before they ordered and listened while his mother explained why she had spent 41 years working in public libraries' ears, even after he could have provided anything she needed. "You kept trying to remove every inconvenience from my life," she told him. "Some inconveniences are where I still get to choose who I am." Julian did not defend himself. He asked what kind of help she wanted from him instead. It was not a complete repair, but it was an honest beginning. Before dessert arrived, Rain began tapping against the restaurant windows. The sound was gentle at first. Then phones across the room displayed a waterfront storm advisory. Celeste read the alert and contacted the front desk. Water had not reached the road, but a bus had stopped operating 2 blocks away. Several passengers were walking toward the hotel. No one asked whether they had reservations. The restaurant supervisor began filling hot water containers. Security unlocked the approved entrance. Nora activated the refuge status from the front desk, and the green light above Magnolia Ballroom illuminated. Julian reached for his phone. Josephine placed one hand over it. "They have a procedure," she said. Then she stood and began helping an employee move chairs away from the central aisle. Within 15 minutes, 11 people were seated safely inside the ballroom. Their names were entered into a new digital log that could not be silently overwritten. Wet coats hung from portable racks. Towels were distributed without anyone worrying about how they would be explained later. When everything was settled, Celeste carried 2 cups of tea toward Josephine. "You missed dessert," she said. "I have survived greater disappointments." Celeste handed her a cup, careful. "The cups are thin and the tea is hot." Josephine smiled at the familiar warning. Beyond them, the ballroom doors remained open. Rain reflected in the service corridor windows, but no one outside Quay was required to prove their importance before being allowed through. Celeste had not returned to Meridian Quay because a billionaire restored her dignity. Julian's influence had opened a review, but records, testimony, and ordinary courage had changed the hotel. The real test of kindness had never been what Josephine was worth. It was whether Celeste would have opened the door when she believed Josephine had nothing to offer in return. If doing the right thing could cost you your livelihood, would you trust your own judgment? Or wait for someone powerful to prove you were right?